In the last video, we looked at the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire was a great empire. In fact, the greatest empire that had been in the western part of Europe, involves the eastern part of Europe and in Europe itself, right from the beginning. And so what we see is that that empire was great, it was big, it was sprawling. But it decided that it wanted to keep expanding its movement. And in fact, where it expanded to was to the Greek peninsula, to the Greek or the Peloponnesian Peninsula, the southern part of Greece. And of course, the Greeks were wholly unprepared to deal with the Persian horde, the Persians that came under Xerxes. And what we see is that when they came to Greece, the Greeks were unprepared because they weren't one country. What the Greeks were was really a collection of city-states. You may have heard of some of them, like Sparta and Athens. A movie was made recently called 300, which is the celebration of the 300 warriors of Sparta who stood up against the horde of the Persians coming to take over Greece as well, as they had done all the countries up to that point. But of course, we realize that the Greeks had been able to make a change. And what they did was they found a leader that was able to bind together those city-states and be able to stand together as one group against the horde of the Persians. That person was Philip of Macedon. Philip of Macedon. And what Philip did was he was able to combine them and he was able to repel the Persians from Greece. But of course that wasn't the end of it. Because the next thing that happened is that of course Philip is assassinated and his son takes over from him. And his son is Alexander III. Alexander III of Macedon. We now know him as Alexander the Great. Now, I think we can't really pin down how great Alexander really was. Alexander was great because he has single-handedly, in a sense, changed the history of the Western world. Now, I know that that's a huge claim to say that one man could have changed the history of the Western world. But in many ways, that's true. Alexander was only 16 years old when he took over the Greek army. And what he began to do was to say, well, the Persians wanted to attack us. Well, it's time for us to attack them. And that's what he began to do. And for the next 16 years, Alexander was at war. And what he did was he was able to take over all the territory of the Persian Empire. He was able to go all the way through to the Indus River in India. He took over everything in the Middle East, right through into Egypt, and more of the north part of Africa, and then everything up to the Italian peninsula. All of that became part of what became known as the Greek Empire. Now, the Greek Empire brought more than just taking over conquest. It was more than just about conquest. It was about Hellenization. Now, this is a very important word because it's one that we will see again in the Newer Testament as well. Hellenization. Hellenization means the process of making another group Greek, to make them Greek. And that's really what he believed. He believed that it wasn't enough just to go and take over a country just so that you can have a conquest. What he wanted to do was he wanted to share Greek culture and the Greek language with every nation that he was able to conquer. And that meant that for the first time, this part of the Middle East, which was made up of thousands of different tribes, all speaking different languages, for the first time, what Alexander was able to do was to bring them together, all speaking the same language. Now, maybe not their first language, but at least all of them could understand Greek. And it's the understanding of Greek that were able to communicate with each other, that would enable trade and commerce and science. All those things that actually are able to build great empires are connected to language. As we now see today, for example, in the spread of American English. That American English through the internet and through other forms have, in a sense, imperialized or colonized the rest of the world, as everybody begins to speak English in order to be able to communicate, particularly with that great superpower of America. And so we see the same thing happens in terms of Greece. Is that if you wanted to connect with Greece, if you wanted to trade with Greece, if you wanted to grow your population, then you needed to be able to speak Greek, you needed to know the Greek practices and perspectives. And so that's what happens with Alexander, is he takes over that whole part of the known world. And not only do they bring the language and the practices, but they also bring their gods. You need to remember that the Greeks, of course, were polytheists. They believed in many gods. You may remember the top god, or the main god of the Greeks was the god Zeus. But then there were the other gods that were the gods of the sea, and gods of rivers, and gods of the land. And one of the major gods was the god of the underworld. The underworld. And you can see very quickly here the underworld and the god called Hades. Now, in fact, Hades even becomes another word for hell for us. And you can see that how that would have been an influence to both the Jews and later on to the Christians as they began to grapple with this concept of good and evil, and a concept even of afterlife, which they never really had. The Greeks would introduce them to an understanding of an afterlife. Because for the Greeks, the people who had actually offended the gods would, instead of going to where the gods live, would go down into Hades, into this place of, it's not so much of torment, it was more of a place of waiting, a place of shadow. Very similar to the Hebrew concept of Sheol, or the place of shadow. But the god who ruled in that underworld was Hades. So you can see there's lots of connection between the Greek concept of religion and what became part of the Hebrew concept, and later on the Christian concept as well. So the Hellenization took place throughout wherever Alexander went. He was an administrator, he was a statesman, and he built schools and gymnasia and all those kinds of things all over the place, bringing Greek culture into the places where he connected them. We'll read more about, or we'll find out more about some of this concept when we get to the New Testament and the influence that it played. But suffice to say that he dies at the age of 32, most probably by assassination. And his kingdom is then divided into, or his empire is divided between 4 of his generals. The 2 main generals that are of interest to us is Ptolemy and the Seleucid. These are the 2 dynasties that come out of 2 of the generals. The Ptolemies were originally given this part of the Holy Land and Egypt, and the Seleucids were given the Asia Minor area. But after about 100 years of wrangling and fighting between them, the Seleucids finally took over the Holy Land as well, and the Ptolemies were left with just the parts of Egypt and that part of northern Africa. The Ptolemies continued, the Seleucids continued. The Ptolemies, the most famous of the Ptolemies is, of course, Cleopatra, Queen Cleopatra. She was one of the Ptolemies, and in fact, she's the one who becomes a consort to both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, when the Roman Empire begins to flex its expansion into North Africa as well. But the Seleucids continue under the leadership of their particular king, and his name was Antiochus III. And Antiochus III is the one who takes over that area, and in fact had quite good relationships with the Jews who were now in Judea. But Antiochus IV was very different. In fact, he gave himself the nickname Epiphany, or Epiphanes, which means God with us. Essentially what Antiochus was saying was that I am the embodiment of God. And of course the Jews didn't like that at all. But Antiochus was on a mission. And his mission was to convert the Jews to following his religion rather than following Yahweh. It's at this point that a group rises up to counteract this. And that group that counteracts this are called the Maccabees. So let me recap about the Greeks. The Greeks begin under Philip of Macedon through Alexander, and Alexander takes over this whole area of the Middle East, bringing Greek culture, bringing the Greek language, bringing the Greek Parthenon of gods, all pantheon of gods, all those things come into this area and begin to affect some of the writings that are happening within this Middle Eastern environment. They begin to bring some of these Western ideas of philosophy and perspective. You need to remember that, in fact, Alexander's mentor, his mentor, the person who taught him things or taught him about the world, was in fact the greatest of all the philosophers, a guy by the name, or one of the great ones, called Aristotle. Aristotle had taught him all about reason and using reason to find the answers and the process of life. The Greeks have been the most significant impact on this Middle Eastern framework because it changed the whole outlook and connection of the people and changed it into one which was more Western rather than the Eastern influence of the Persians.